Even though he's every bit as much of a dictatorship as Xi Jinping in China or Vladimir Putin in Russia, he's much more successful. He's able to actually run people effectively, have conversations with them, manage some of the details, and the job that he has to do is a lot easier than either of those two mega states. Saudi Arabia has a mid-sized population. You're really only talking a little more than 30 million people, and it's a one-horse show when it comes to the economy. It's really just oil. And especially if you're bringing in people to work the oil fields for you, you get to decide policy and foreign policy and strategic policy and general direction, but the details are handled by competent people. So a dictatorship can work in a place like Saudi Arabia, where it'd be far more difficult in a place like China or Russia. So a little bit of background about how he got there. Over a century ago, the tribe of Saud, which ultimately MBS is descended from, cut a series of deals with the merchants who controlled the cities on the west coast. Now, at the time, we're talking pre-industrial here, so the tribe of Saud was basically a bunch of desert raiders, whereas the folks on the coast saw themselves as more sophisticated, and that's pretty much accurate. And the deal that was cut was that social policy and political policy would be set by the tribe, whereas the folks on the coast would handle all the trade and all the economics. It was a good deal for both, and to be perfectly blunt, the folks on the coast got the better part of the deal. But then after the 1920s, oil was found in the interior, and all of a sudden the tribes had more money than they knew what to do with, and they took over completely, isolated the coast, and in essence, the tribe of Saud became the House of Saud. So you've got these people descended from desert raiders who were hyper-violent, who all of a sudden had more money than God and could impose whatever whim they had upon the world. For a long time, the leadership of Saudi Arabia were a series of kings, princes, elevated to king, called the Sudari Seven. 7 brothers, all born from the same wife of the initial king of Saudi Arabia. But they ruled until they died, and they were all more or less the same age, and so they were getting older and older and older and more decrepit. So it became very clear in Saudi Arabia that they needed to skip a generation, and they eventually settled on Mohammed bin Salman as the crown prince, and he's basically the king now. Now, he is a millennial, he is young, which means assuming he's not assassinated, always a risk, he is likely to be the king of Saudi Arabia for the next 50 years. So Saudi Arabia has something that the Russians and the Chinese will never have. Continuity of government while controlling a resource that no one can do without, because it's not an issue of relocating the manufacturing base. You either have the oil or you don't. So this is a country that is long for this world, and as such, the ambitions of Mohammed bin Salman and the goals of Saudi Arabia are not simply fused, they matter on a global scale. And by far the country that has the most to be concerned about because of this is Iran, who the Saudis have always seen as their primary rival. Now, the Iranians, for their part, have a culture that stretches back over 1,000 years. They say over 3,000, and it's not a ridiculous claim. Now, the Iranians have all kinds of problems, but I think their biggest one is that cultural history gives them a degree of arrogance, and so they just look down on the Arabs. But then here you have Saudi Arabia with a significantly larger economy, who has better relations with the United States, with Japan, with China, with the United Kingdom, with France, with Turkey, with all of the world's powers, because ultimately the Saudis have something that they all need. Which means, in a post-American Middle East, the question isn't, will the Saudis try to take out the Iranians? It's how many allies will they be able to rally to do it for them? And as we get into a bigger and bigger energy crisis globally, MBS's goal of completely destroying the Iranian state all of a sudden looks a lot more feasible. It is easy for the Iranians to close the Strait of Hormuz and restrict energy flows to the rest of the world. But it would be a snap for the Saudis to do it. And unlike the Iranians, the Saudis actually have other outlets. They can get over half their crude out via pipe to the Red Sea and ignore anything that happens in Hormuz. So a war is shaping up in the Middle East that is going to be globally consequential. And with the United States no longer on scene, it all comes down to the ambitions and the foibles of a guy who thinks it's okay to take a hacksaw to journalists who write things about you that are not sufficiently flattering. Fun times ahead. All right, see you soon. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the Washington Monument. We're going to continue our leadership series today, and with that in the background, I thought it'd be a great time to talk about Bill Clinton. It just seemed appropriate. If you were to describe Clinton in one word, it would probably be manic. He was probably the most intelligent leader the United States had had since Jefferson, but he was relatively easily distracted, and he would have ideas at like 1 a.m. and he would call in all the staff from wherever they were to like bounce ideas around. That led to a lot of intellectual dynamism, but it didn't necessarily translate into policy, because his second big quality was that he was kind of like Angela Merkel, and he led from behind. Now with Merkel, when something controversial would pop up, she'd allow someone else to kind of take point, even if